Samuel Little is considered the most prolific serial killer the United States has ever experienced. If we're considering overall victim count, it's said that he's worse than Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer combined. And he would maintain a reign of terror for over 2 decades across numerous states. Ever heard of him? Well, let's begin. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, and his mother was said to have been a prostitute. Would the fact that his mother worked in this industry influence Little's motivation to seek out violence towards women? It's these details that may or may not have a major impact on the development of a young mind, but I digress. Samuel's life in Georgia was short-lived because not too long after his birth, his family would move to Lorain, Ohio, where he was mainly raised by his grandmother. As he grew into a teen, Little would attend Hawthorne Junior High School, where he would have continual problems with discipline and achievement. He would also collect true crime magazines that depicted graphic details and images of death and murder. It turns out that Little would have already begun to fantasize about death and killing before he even reached junior high, claiming that even when he was just in kindergarten, he would have sexual fantasies about strangling women to death, specifically his kindergarten teacher, though eventually these fantasies would become more than anyone would have imagined, and he would begin defying authority to a higher degree when, in 1956, he was convicted of breaking and entering into a home in Omaha, Nebraska. At this point, Little was still a juvenile, 16 years old, and he would be held in a juvenile institution. But this would only be the beginning of a long string of encounters with the law, because it seemed that Little didn't respect authority at all. So, in 1961, Samuel would again commit a crime and was sentenced to 3 years in prison after he broke into a furniture store in Lorain, Ohio. Even real jail time seemed to have no effect on his respect for obeying laws, because once he was released 3 years later in 1964, he would continue breaking laws and committing crimes. So much so that by the year 1975, 11 years after his first prison sentence, Little had a rap sheet a mile long, which included 26 arrests across 11 states. His charges involved theft, assault, attempted rape, fraud, and attacks on government officials. As you can tell, Little didn't strive to be an exemplary member of society. On the contrary, it seemed he was driven only by base desires. But then again, what serial killer isn't? And so, Little would begin to prey on prostitutes, drug addicts, and women belonging to minority races. Was this an intentional attempt to minimize the probability of being held responsible? Because it seemed that every time he was caught in the act of preying on these women, the justice system wouldn't appropriately punish this monster. And even when the bodies of his victims were discovered, it's said that minimal effort went into finding who was responsible. Across 35 years in 19 states, women would continue to go missing. Their bodies would eventually be found and DNA would be collected. And it may have been due to technological limitations, but this DNA would just sit, never matched to any individual, and proper justice would float in a perpetual state of limbo. At one point in 1982, Samuel would be arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and was charged with the murder of 22-year-old Melinda Rose LaPree, who went missing in September of that same year. though a grand jury would fail to conclude responsibility on Little's part and decline to indict him for the murder. Shortly after, Samuel would be extradited to Florida and charged with the murder of 26-year-old Patricia Ann Mount, who was found dead around the same time in September 1982. The key witnesses reported that Patricia was last seen with Samuel, and they were the only source of evidence that linked him to the death of Patricia. But unfortunately, there was an overall mistrust of the witnesses, which led to the acquittal of Samuel's involvement with the disappearance in 1984. It seemed that this trial was ongoing for 2 years before it was dropped. This mistrust may have stemmed from the fact that these key witnesses were either impoverished, worked in the sex industry, or were of a marginalized demographic based on skin color. In any case, Samuel would be free to continue his string of abductions and murders. Obviously, we now know the direct involvement he had, but there may have been less desire to solve what was going on back then, and he would later move to California and stayed near San Diego during the same year he was acquitted, in 1984. But his close run-ins with almost being caught would have no effect on Samuel, because in October 1984, the same year he was acquitted, Little would be caught after being reported of abducting, beating, and strangling 22-year-old Lori Barros, who luckily survived. From what I've gathered, he only served a month for this incident because shortly after, Little was found by police in the back seat of his vehicle with an unconscious woman who was also beaten and strangled. This second event occurred around the same area that his first victim escaped from, but Samuel would only serve a total of 2.5 years for both of these incidents and would be released in February 1987. When he regained his freedom, he would move to Los Angeles, where he would continue his string of murders. At the very least, Little would go on to murder 10 more victims during his time in LA. Little had been active for over 30 years since the 1970s, and it seemed that during the year 2005, he had slowed down or stopped altogether. In total, Little attests to kidnapping, beating, and murdering a total of 91 plus women during the years he was actively hunting his prey, so things would be quiet for a while. With minimal to no suspicion amounting on anyone, let alone Samuel, the missing women's cases would be left cold and uninvestigated, and it would remain like this until September 5th, 2012, when Samuel was arrested at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. It seemed that these cold cases were reopened and Little's file was looked into, which investigators began linking to multiple discovered remains between 1987 and 1989. But after reinvestigating, the authorities didn't have definitive proof because there was no DNA on file belonging to Little. So when they apprehended him in 2012, it was under the pretense of a narcotics charge, which gave authorities probable cause to extradite him to California, where these murders had occurred, and collect DNA from Samuel. With a fresh sample of DNA, it was an exact match to what was found with the remains of the 3 victims uncovered in California. Specifically, Carol Lene Elford, murdered on July 13, 1987, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, murdered on September 3, 1987, and Audrey Nelson Everett, murdered on August 14, 1989. All 3 women were attacked and later found in Los Angeles. So, Samuel would be extradited, this time to Los Angeles, which would result in him being charged on January 3, 2013, for the murders of these innocent women. And as the investigations continued, Little would be accused of involvement in over 3 dozen more murders that occurred during the 1980s, which were up until that year cold cases. It seemed that Little's luck had run out, and he was about to face punishment for his years of depravity and brutality towards women. So, in September of 2014, Samuel would face trial for the murder of the 3 women he was initially charged for, which would present DNA evidence as well as witness testimonies from women who were attacked by Little during the 80s, and he would be found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. During the investigation, Little would be given the nickname the Choke and Stroke Killer because he would sexually gratify himself as he choked the life out of the women he preyed on. Though Little would attest to his innocence and non-involvement in any of the murders that have been presented, a common strategy for self-preservation. Regardless, the proof was presented and he would never see the light of day again. As a result, he would begin confessing between 2018 and 2020 to numerous other murders that he was involved in, and it accumulated to a total of 93 victims he claims to have attacked and disposed of across the 30+ years he was active. And thus, Little would receive consecutive life sentences for the remainder of his crimes, which resulted in justice for these poor women finally being served. Little would later die on December 30th, 2020, and it marked the end to a reign of terror no one should ever have to face. Samuel, the Choke and Stroke Killer, Little, was a depraved man who preyed on the impoverished, the less fortunate, and never had an ounce of remorse in his body. He took what he felt was entitled to him, with disregard of the outcome. These are the individuals that are most dangerous, and unfortunately, we sometimes don't know until it's too late. In any case, thanks again for tuning in. I appreciate every one of you. If you enjoy the content, please leave a comment, a like, and subscribe, as I'll be posting videos weekly so you can have something interesting to listen to. With that being said, take care and until next time.